and welcome to the third quarter assessment recorded study guide. There is a lot to cover in this third quarter assessment, so let's get right to it. We're going to be looking at units 6 through 8, and that means that you already have two study guides that cover over a lot of this stuff, unit 6 and 7 study guides, and there's nothing new on here except for unit 8. So anything that's on unit 6 study guide would be good to study. Anything that's good on unit 7 would be good to study as well. But we're going to start with unit 6, and we have just won the Revolutionary War, and we have to figure out what kind of government we're going to have. So they sit down, and in 1781 they make a plan for the government, which are the Articles of Confederation, and this is on page 236. Now, the Articles of Confederation has some basic structures, like it's a republic, so we vote for representatives and things like that. But this is going to be our first setup of a government, and it's not really going to succeed. So in 1781, we set up our first government, which is the Articles of Confederation, and right away we run into some troubles with that. Mainly, the Articles of Confederation, you can't tax, so that's a problem. And you just can't, the government can't enforce laws. And what that does, well, they can't tax, so that means they don't have any money to raise an army, and they can't enforce laws, which means even if they did pass any laws, it doesn't even matter because no one has to follow them because nobody has to worry about a consequence. It's kind of like you get a curfew from your parents, but your parents say, well, yeah, you have this curfew at 11, but you're the one that has to enforce it on yourself. Like if you are late, you have to ground yourself. Well, if you're the one that's grounding yourself, you're probably not going to ground yourself, so what's the point? There's no law. So the country kind of runs into a lot of problems, and one of the big things that happens is Shays' Rebellion, and that has a lot to do with Daniel Shay. So we're going to be looking at that on page, they talk about Daniel Shay and his rebellion on page 35, and then again on page 239. So 235 and 239. Basically what's happening here is Shay and others like him are mad about having to pay some taxes, and they're not getting paid because they were in the war, and you can't pay your soldiers if you don't have any money to pay them with, and you can't collect taxes. So these farmers and soldiers out in Massachusetts get really angry about what they think is unfair taxation and the fact that they're not getting any money. So what this does is it shows that the government is really weak, is way too weak, because they can't even put down a rebellion of some backwoods farmers with some pitchforks. They can't even, handle that. They are running into trouble. They can't even, stop them until, weeks and whatever later, when the damage is done and a lot of things are going bad. So it wakes people up a little bit. They realize, these Articles of Confederation, these probably are not going to cut it for us. And they get together and they start talking about a new government at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The Constitutional Convention is going to be found on page 244. So there are a few reasons why there is this Constitutional Convention. The first thing is Shays' Rebellion, because they realize, hey, that can't happen anymore. And then also, they want to set up trade laws for the nation. They want to get some national trade laws going, and under the Articles of Confederation, the national government can't set up these laws because no one will have to follow them. So they decide, we need to fix these problems. So they get together, and we know a lot about this because of James Madison, and he's going to be known as the father of the Constitution. And he comes up with the first plan, basically, the first idea that anybody puts forward is the Virginia Plan, and that is going to be found on page 244 through 245. The Virginia Plan, if we look here, it has the basic structure of what we know as our government today. It sets up that there are going to be 3 branches: legislative, executive, judicial, but the difference is that in the legislative branch, it's going to be 2 branches, but all of them are going to be based on state population. So with the Virginia Plan, the bigger states are going to like this, because the more people you have, the more votes you get. But the smaller states don't like this, so they come up with their own plan, which is going to be presented by William Patterson, who is this guy right down here. And that is the New Jersey Plan, and that is going to be on page 246. So the smaller states don't like the Virginia Plan because of the state population thing. So they come up with their own, and they say the same deal: legislative, executive, judicial, but it's just going to be 1 house, and everybody is going to get 1 vote for every state, no matter what the size is. And what that would do is make everybody have an equal amount, an equal playing field. But the bigger states don't like that, because if the smaller states, if a state has 100 people and it has the same amount of votes as a state with 500,000 people, that doesn't make any sense. That's not really representing everybody equally. It's giving the smaller states an advantage. So the larger states don't like this. So they're all, the bigger states are like, no, that Virginia or that New Jersey plan sucks, and then the smaller states are like, no, you guys suck, and then they're just like yelling back and forth. And this goes on for a while until we come up with the Great Compromise, which is presented by Roger Sherman. And that the Great Compromise is going to be outlined on page 246. And this guy right here is Roger Sherman. And basically we have the Virginia Plan, and they want 2 houses, both based on population. That's their setup. The New Jersey Plan, we have on the other side of this, they want 1 house, and everybody's going to get equal amount. So what the Great Compromise does is it takes both of these things, and it gives us 2 houses, 1 based on population. So we take one of these ideas from over here, and then 1 is going to be equal, and everybody's going to have the same amount. So we get rid of the 2-house system with double population, but we use the 2-house system and have 1 population, 1 based on equal representation. So that kind of solves the issues that people have with this, and this becomes the government of the United States, and it's the system that we use today, the Great Compromise. That's why it's the Great Compromise. It was such a great idea that they put it into place. All right. Now, one of the last obstacles from the Constitutional Convention is the 3/5 Compromise. And the problem is that, well, first of all, the 3/5 Compromise, we're looking at that on page 247. The problem is the southern states don't want to give up their slaves, but they also don't really want to count them in taxation, and they don't want to have to give them rights and voting rights and all that kind of stuff. They want to count them in their population, because the more people you have, the more votes you get in one of these houses. And so the northern states say, no, you can't count them in your population if you're not going to count them in your taxing, and you're not, going to count them in the votes and everything like that. So they come up with this compromise. It's all about compromise at the Constitutional Convention. They decide that basically for every 5 slaves is going to equal 3 free people, and that the slave trade cannot be banned. So slave trade can't be banned until 1808. And that obviously doesn't really work out. I mean, this issue really isn't, worked out until the Civil War. But at this point, at the Constitutional Convention, we're not going to outlaw slavery, but we come up with this 3/5 Compromise, and it works out for, most people. Everybody's like, okay, that's fine. So now the next step is that this Constitution that they make, this document that they make at the Constitutional Convention, has to be ratified. And ratify means to approve it. So it has to go out to all the states, and they have to decide, hey, this is what the Constitution is, and everybody has to decide, okay, we're going to have it or we're going to not. So there are a lot of people that are worried about this Constitution giving the national government too much power, but the Federalists are named the Federalists because they support the Constitution. So Federalists support, actually, let's say that Federalists are for the Constitution, for Federalists, for the Constitution. So they say it's based on federalism, which is shared powers, which we will talk about later. But it's the idea that the national government and the state share powers. Each of them have a certain amount, different types. They both can collect taxes, but one isn't going to be more powerful than the other. The anti-federalists were against the Constitution, and they think that it needs a Bill of Rights. They also think that the executive branch is going to gain too much power, and it's going to turn into a situation like a king, and it's going to be tyranny. So they don't really want to support that either. So the Federalists are for the Constitution, and they need to get their point across. The Anti-Federalists say we need a Bill of Rights, and it's going to turn into a king. So the Federalists say, okay, here is our reasoning behind the Constitution, and this is why it's a good thing. And it's a series of essays that they write called the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers, you can read about those on page 250. And what we're looking at is just a series of essays explaining why the Constitution is good, why the Constitution makes sense, why we should vote for it. So eventually, the states ratify the Constitution, and to get everybody on the same page, James Madison sits down and he writes the Bill of Rights, and you can look at that story on page 253. And basically, it's important because it addresses the concerns of the citizens and the states that were like, hey, there aren't any rights written down. What if the national government just decides they're going to take away all of our rights? Well, James Madison decides, okay, we'll write them so everybody's happy. So he sits down and he writes the first 10 amendments, and that's called the Bill of Rights. And we'll talk more about the specifics of those in just a little bit. So that's the end of Unit 6, and now starting with the Unit 7 stuff, we're looking at the 7 principles of the Constitution. We all know what popular sovereignty is, and the definitions for most of these terms are going to be found on page 262, those short little paragraphs. Popular is going to mean people. Sovereignty is right to rule. So together, popular sovereignty is the people have the right to rule. They are the kings. They are the people in charge. This is where our right to vote comes from. This is how people have a voice in the government. People have the right to rule. In our government, we also set up the second principle of the Constitution was republicanism, also on page 262, and we vote for representatives. And that is like, the situation where we talk about all the time where we have a classroom and we're going to have a school-wide vote, and instead of everybody going up and voting, we're going to pick one person to go up to the office for us and vote in the way that represents our classroom. So yes or no, whatever the majority of the people want in our classroom is what they're going to vote, and that is our representative, and that's a system of republicanism. Limited government is also on page 262. The thing you need to remember about limited government, it's that rule of law kind of deal. Everybody has to follow the rules. The situation where if I go into a store and I steal a candy bar, I'm going to get in trouble. If a member of the House of Representatives goes in and steals a candy bar, he's going to get in trouble too. If, you go out on your front lawn and somebody's just walking by, minding their own business, walking their dog, and you shoot them in the face, you're going to jail. You just murdered somebody. If the President of the United States goes out on his front lawn, some guy's just walking by, minding his own business, walking his dog, and he shoots him in the face, he's going to jail too. No matter what, both of those things, both of those situations, is still murder. So everybody's going to jail in that situation. So So yeah, limited government, rule of law. Back to federalism a little bit. I did just kind of talk about, I mentioned that, we're looking at shared powers. On this, you can read a definition kind of on 262, and then also a chart is on 282. You need to think about that the powers are shared, and that some of the bigger powers hold with the national government, some of the smaller things go to the states, and they both can do things that are important to each. But if a law from a state is in conflict with a law from the national government, which one is followed? And that is always, always, always the national or the higher power is always followed, because state laws never take precedent over federal laws in the situation of federalism. So that's something important to remember as well. Moving on to the next thing on your study guide, which is separation of powers. This is where we get the three branches of the government: the legislative, executive, and judicial. What you need to know here is, that they each have certain powers that it divides it into certain areas, and which branch has which powers, and which branch is what. Like, the legislative branch is Congress, the executive branch is the president, the judicial branch is the Supreme Court, and which things each of those branches can do. So we start out with powers granted to Congress. This is something that you can read right there for you. It's 272 through 274. It is Article 1, Section 8. And, it lists out the things that Congress can do. Like, they can collect taxes. So Congress, again, is the legislative branch, and you need to know that. So Congress is the legislative branch. They can collect taxes. They are the ones that declare war. They make the laws. Like, they vote on everything. They come up with them. So Congress is the legislative branch. They make the laws. They declare war. They collect. They set the taxes. All that kind of stuff. And you can read about all those things, and you need to know that. Okay. The very next section in the Constitution has to do with the things that Congress is not allowed to do, and you can also read about those on page 274 through 275. Just look through there and think about, what is it saying that Congress, basically just cannot do. And so the next thing on your study guide are the powers of the president. This is going to be kind of the same deal with the powers of the Congress. This is on page 277 to 278. You can read about that. So the president is the executive branch. Wow, awesome. Look at that. I don't even know what that says. All right, so executive branch, the executive branch enforces the laws. Powers of the president, we've talked about him enforcing the laws. He's the one that makes treaties. He doesn't approve them. Congress approves them. He just makes them. He can pardon people. And, just read through these pages and you'll find some more information about that. But, president is the executive branch. He's enforcing the laws, pardon people, make treaties, all that kind of stuff. The last thing here with the branches is the Supreme Court. We're looking at the judicial branch now. They interpret the laws, or, kind of figure out what they mean. They use judicial review, which is something that we'll talk about here in a little bit, but they basically decide if things are unconstitutional. So the Supreme Court decides if laws are unconstitutional. They interpret the judicial branch, all that kind of stuff. Now, all of these things together, all of these different powers that each of these branches have work with one another into a system that we call checks and balances. And if you want to read about checks and balances, we're talking 262, 263, and then also there is a chart on page 281. It's actually this chart. How convenient. It will show you how, the president checks on Congress, and Congress checks on the president, and both of those check on the judicial branch, and the judicial branch checks on both the other ones, and all this kind of stuff. But just check out that chart. And yeah, so we've talked a little bit about the Bill of Rights, and that's where this last principle of the Constitution comes in, which is individual rights. Individual rights, it talks about it on page 262. It also, the Bill of Rights is 286. And just focusing on what are individual rights. It's those protections that everybody has, like freedom of speech, but that you have freedom of speech and freedom of press and freedom of religion, but which amendment is that? That would be the First Amendment. So these are those 5 basic freedoms. I think this is on page 289, I think. So you have the five basic freedoms of freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. So just know that, in your First Amendment, you have those things. The rights of the citizen, that's going to be page 282. This is going to be Article 4 of the Constitution. It says Article 4, and then underneath it, there's this little paragraph, a little thing that says rights of the citizen. Read that. It talks about what happens if I go from Maine to California. If I'm going through all these states, do I lose my freedom of speech? Do I lose the rights that are listed in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights? Read that and figure it out. So yeah. All right, moving on to Unit 8 stuff, which is stuff that we haven't talked about yet. So yeah, at least not on a study guide. Okay, President Cabinet. The beginning of Unit 8 starts with President Washington and the things that he does, and how a lot of the things are new and nobody's done them before, and they set up a precedent. And one of those things is his cabinet, and that is on page 314. And you have you have these departments that help the president carry out his responsibilities, and each head of the department is called a secretary. So you have the Secretary of the State, you have the Secretary of the Treasury, and the first Secretary of State is Thomas Jefferson, and the first Secretary of Treasury is this guy down here, Alexander Hamilton. This is a picture of kind of the original cabinet. You got 4 people, and then this over here is a picture of the current cabinet, where you have a lot more than 4. So the first Secretary of Treasury is Alexander Hamilton, and he has to figure out how to fix kind of the nation's finances, because we're in trouble. And he sees that our number one problem is war debt, and he wants to pay all of the war debt off. This is on page 315 through 316. Basically, he says we have to pay off our war debt, because if we don't, other countries are not going to take us seriously, and they're not going to trade with us. So they're not going to do business with us if we don't pay off our war debt. So we have to figure out what we're going to do and how we're going to pay off this war debt. His idea centers around increasing tariffs. And a tariff is something that increases, it's a tax on imports. This is on page 316, definition for it. And what this does is it gets rid of competition kind of for American businesses, because it makes the American good $4, and then it raises the price of the foreign good to, it adds $2 to it because of the tax, so it ends up being $6. So that means more people are going to buy the $4 good, which means that the United States business is going to do better. So basically it encourages people to buy things from American businesses in the United States, which grows those American businesses. So that's how he wants to increase revenue, pay off the war debt, and he wants to do that through tariffs. The next thing we look at are these 2 treaties, Pinckney's and Jay's Treaty. Now we're going to talk about both of these together. Pinckney's Treaty is between Spain and the U.S., and Jay's Treaty is in between us, or England, and the U.S. So this is John Jay down here. This is what you really need to understand about both of these treaties. First of all, Jay's Treaty gets rid of the British out here. They have forts out here. This is our land, and they are still holding forts in this area. So Jay's Treaty gets rid of those, so we don't have to worry about that stuff. Pinckney's Treaty sets up where we are able to use the Mississippi River, and it sets this border down here once and for all. Well, not for all, but for now. And that eases the tensions out in those areas. So both of these, whoa, I don't want to use red, so I'm not going to anymore. So both of these ease frontier tensions, and that is a big deal for both of these treaties. Once that happens, we look at these political parties. These political parties pop up right after George Washington retires, and even though he warns them, hey, don't have political parties, nobody listens, and they set up the first two political parties, Democratic Republican Party and the Federalist Party. You can find these. There's a really, really good chart on page 329, and it's going to outline the differences and similarities between both of these parties. Basically, you got your leaders of the Democratic Republicans is Jefferson and Madison, and Federalists is Hamilton and Adams. And, if you look at this chart over here, it's going to outline some of the things. Federalists wanted strong national government. Democratic Republicans wanted strong state governments. The Federalists wanted to have an alliance with Britain because they thought the trade would be better. Democratic Republicans wanted an alliance with France because they were going through that French Revolution, all that kind of stuff. So, the Federalists are going to have more of a loose interpretation of the Constitution. The Democratic Republicans are going to have a strict. So, just look at that chart and figure out kind of the similarities, differences, and all that kind of stuff. So, the Federalists come to power after Washington retires, and through a few events like the XYZ affair, they gain a lot of popularity, they gain a lot of power, and they kind of abuse that power. And one of the clearest examples about how they abuse that power is the Alien and Sedition Acts, and that is on page 331. Basically, this is going to limit unlimited free speech, which makes people really angry. And Jefferson and Madison want to get rid of the Alien and Sedition Act, so they put forward this idea of states' rights, and they put this idea forward in the Kentucky and Virginia proposals. So, in the Kentucky and Virginia proposals, they say that the state has the right to nullify or get rid of an act of the federal government, and that's where we first see these things. And we're going to talk more about states' rights in later units, but you can read about the Kentucky and Virginia proposals in this because that's what they want to do. They want to get rid of it. They're unsuccessful, but it doesn't matter because in the election of 1800, Jefferson wins and he gets rid of those acts on his own anyway. And one thing that happens right at the beginning of Jefferson's presidency, well, first of all, in 1800, there's an election, and Adams runs and Jefferson run, and the big thing that the Federalists are worried about are radicals. They think that Jefferson is a radical and that he is going to ruin the country and all this kind of stuff, but it doesn't really matter because he wins. And at the end of Adams' presidency, Adams is trying to appoint all of these judges and all this different stuff, and Jefferson's like, well, because in order for a judge to be truly appointed, he has to receive this piece of paper. And this guy named William Marbury, who is this guy right here, doesn't get his piece of paper in time. And Jefferson becomes president, and he's like, don't deliver that piece of paper. It's James Madison's job, this guy, to deliver the piece of paper, and Jefferson says, don't deliver it, we're not going to worry about it. So Marbury gets really mad, and there's a Supreme Court case, and Marbury says, hey, the Congress gave the Supreme Court the power to decide this fight, so decide it. And the Supreme Court says, well, we'll look at it, and actually, the act that gave us that power is unconstitutional because you can't give powers to branches of the government. You can't just create powers. So actually, we can't decide it, so you can't be a judge. Sorry. And what this does is it sets up judicial review, and that's that idea that the Supreme Court can declare things unconstitutional. This is on page 342. Basically, this gives balance to the branches of the government, because now, better write review here. So judicial review. So now each branch has, powers that everybody can check on everybody, and it gives lasting balance to the checks and balances of everything. So, yeah. All right, moving on to something else in Jefferson's presidency, which is the Louisiana Purchase. So Thomas Jefferson down here, third president of the United States. There are some problems with the Port of New Orleans and not being able to use it. The Spanish have shut off the Port of New Orleans to the Americans, and that's a problem because the Americans would travel down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico through New Orleans, around here, and then trade with all of these East Coast cities. Well, if you can't go through the Port of New Orleans, you can't do that, which means that you have to go through this way, and that's going to take a lot longer, and it's going to make you lose a lot of money. So Americans are really angry, and Jefferson doesn't want people to go fight the Spanish and then fight the French as well, because now the French have control over it, and they still are closing the port. So Jefferson decides, I'll go down here and I'll offer France, I'll say, we'll buy the Port of New Orleans. Just this little part right here. Well, this guy right here, Napoleon, who is the leader of France, decides, well, instead of buying the Port of New Orleans, how about you just buy this whole stinking Louisiana Purchase? And Jefferson's like, oh, that's a lot of land, and that would be nice. But he's worried about it, Jefferson is, because the Constitution does not give him the power. It doesn't say the president can buy land, so he's worried about it because he has a strict interpretation of the Constitution. So he's thinking, maybe I shouldn't buy this, but he wants a nation of farmers, so he goes ahead and buys it anyway. So we buy this from France. Napoleon's the leader of France. This is the French flag. This is Thomas Jefferson. He buys it, and then he says, well, we have to explore this area. So he sends these two guys, Lewis and Clark, out to explore this area. The Lewis and Clark expedition, we're kind of looking on page 346, and it goes through 348. They leave St. Louis in 1804. They go up the Missouri. They're trying to find an all-water route. Doesn't quite work out for them. They don't find an all-water route. They have to march through the Rocky Mountains with help from Sacagawea. Sacagawea is a helpful guide, first of all, because she can guide them through the Rocky Mountains. She speaks several languages, which helps them with Native American tribes. But also, having this Native American woman with them shows other Native American tribes that they are on kind of a peaceful mission, and it assures that they're not going to be attacked all the time, because it shows them, the other Native American tribes, that we're not a war party. We're just trying to have peace and explore and all this kind of stuff. So they make it to the Pacific Ocean. They have to travel all the way back. They make it back to St. Louis in 1806, and that's how we, explore the Louisiana Purchase. So in 1807, Thomas Jefferson, there are some more troubles in the frontier and with the British, and so he says, okay, I don't want to go to war, and we're going to try to stop them from taking our ships, and we're going to stop them from attacking us in the frontier. So we're going to pass the Embargo Act of 1807, which is on page 354. And basically the Embargo Act, he's like, well, I know how to stop them, because we're going to force them to stop, because they're not going to be able to trade with us. The Embargo Act stops trade with foreign nation. So he's thinking, oh, well, this would be great. Well, actually, it hurts the Americans more than it hurts the British or the French, but it goes on, and it's a big issue in the election of 1808, but eventually in 1808, James Madison becomes president. And when James Madison becomes president, the tensions are still high in the frontier, and things are still not very good. And a lot of people want to declare war on Britain, and eventually he decides that that is the right thing to do, and the War of 1812 breaks out. The War of 1812, we're looking at page 355. And so James Madison's president, War of 1812 happens. There's two phases to the war. The first phase is like when Britain is fighting France still in Europe. The second phase is when they beat France, and then they can focus all their attention over here in North America. In the North, the British have some success. They burn down the White House, they capture that, they do all this, but then it kind of stalemates a little bit. It kind of slows down. It's nobody's winning, nobody's losing. It's just kind of like a tie up there. In the South, the Battle of New Orleans happens, and this is in January of 1815. And this is kind of what you need to know about the Battle of New Orleans. It is a great victory for the Americans because the British suffer over 2,000 casualties. The Americans suffer about 71. So that's, overwhelming victory. What you really need to think about is what's the effect of this battle. And really the only effect of this battle is that Andrew Jackson, who is this guy right here, becomes a hero. He becomes a war hero because he led this army that killed 2,000 British people, and only 71 of his men died, and that's all, great and everything. So, but why is that the only effect? Why didn't it have any effect on the war? Well, that's because if you pay attention here, January 1815. Well, the Treaty of Ghent, which this treaty ends the war, this was signed in December of 1814. So that is a month before the Battle of New Orleans, but the news of this treaty does not travel to New Orleans or to Andrew Jackson or the British soon enough to stop this battle from happening. So really the only effect is that Andrew Jackson becomes a hero. The legacy of the war. We're going to see that after the War of 1812, patriotism really increases. They talk about this on page 358. Patriotism really increases. Another thing is that during the war we could not trade, and because we couldn't trade, we had to learn how to make the things that we usually would trade for, but now we can't. So we had to make those ourselves, and because we had to make them ourselves and we couldn't trade, that leads us to becoming better at making things on our own. Like if you couldn't go to the store to buy clothes or buy food, you would have to make them on your own. Well, after 4 or 5 years, you would get a lot better at hunting and sewing and everything that you would need to do to survive. Well, because you would get better, you wouldn't then, after this, have to go back to the store, really, necessarily. You could just do it on your own. So the United States is able to increase their manufacturing. They get better at making things, and that kind of kicks off the growth of the United States. And it's all because during the war we couldn't trade. So that's one of the legacies of the War of 1812. All right, so that is the third quarter assessment recorded study guide. Study up, use that study guide, use your previous study guides, watch this video again. So good luck. You'll do great.